Okay, today I want to talk about how I made this dragon wall light, which just kind of happened by accident. I wanted to create something like this, but I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to work, so I just started playing around with the material nodes, and this is the result. So the first thing I did was search for a free dragon symbol or something like that, and I found several that I liked, but I decided to use this one. So then I did what I always do. I opened the image in Inkscape, selected it, went to the path menu and hit trace bitmap. It looked okay, so I hit apply, went to the layers tab and turned off the original image, then over to the file menu, save a copy, set the type to plain SVG and hit save. Now here in Blender, I'll import the SVG file. Right-click and set origin to geometry. Scale it up to 3 on X and Y. And hit Ctrl A and apply scale. Then I'll rotate it up 90 degrees and move it back so it's close to this back wall. And I'll move these apart so there's some space between them. And by the way, this is just a cube with the front face removed. I hit Shift A and created a cube, and I'll move it over here and switch to edit mode, face selection, select the front face, hit X and delete faces. Then I selected all the faces, right click, mesh tools, flip normals, and that inverts the faces of the cube so the front faces are now on the inside. And I also came up here to the shading menu and turned on backface culling. If it's off, you can see the back faces of the cube as you move around. But if you turn it on, now you can see through the back faces and it makes it a lot easier to work. So I'll delete this cube and switch to render display so I can show you my lighting setup. And over here in the world properties, I have this HDRI that's lighting my scene. And I set the strength down to 0.2, so it's just providing a little bit of light. If I set the strength to 1, you see it gets very bright inside the cube. So 0.2 makes it much darker and easier to see what the light is doing. The other thing I did was hit Shift A and added an area light. And I moved it up here to the ceiling. I set the power to 6. And I left the color set to white, and that just helps to bring a little bit of light back inside. So I'll switch back to solid display, and the last thing I'll do is split up my screen into multiple viewports, so I don't have to jump back and forth between these tabs up here and solid display and render display over here. I want to see everything in this one workspace. And to do that, I'll bring my cursor down here and hover it in the corner until it switches to this cross symbol. Then I'll click and drag up to create a new window. And then I'll click on this down arrow and switch to the shader editor. Then I'll hover my cursor up here in the top left corner until I see the cross symbol. Then I'll click and drag out another window. And then with my cursor up here on this top toolbar, I can roll my scroll wheel until I get to the end of the toolbar, and I'll switch to render display. And then I'll zoom in on this dragon that I'm going to be working on. And that's it for the setup. So now with this new dragon selected, I'll come over to the material properties and I'll hit this minus button to delete the current material. Then I'll come down to the shading workspace and I'll click the new button to create a new material. And I'm going to name it blue since I'm going to be making this dragon a blue light. And Blender added this 0.001 to the end because I probably still have a previous blue material left over from before when I was testing this out. But anyway, the first thing I want to do is hit Shift A and add an emission node and a mix shader node. I'll plug the principled BSDF into the top shader input, and I'll plug the emission node into the bottom shader input, And then I'll plug the mix shader into the surface input on the material output node. And now it's glowing, and I can change the emission color to whatever I want. But I want this to be a blue light, so I'll set it to a deep blue. But now it isn't really producing light anymore. If I zoom in, you can see there is some reflected light on the wall, but it's not much, so I'll increase the strength of the emission to 100. And now it's producing light, but the whole thing is white again, so I need a couple more nodes. So I'm going to add a layer weight node and a color ramp. And I'll plug this Fresnel output into the color ramp, and I'll plug the color ramp into the factor input on the mix shader. And now the dragon is a light blue, which is better, but it's not what I want. I only want the light coming out of the back faces of the dragon, so I'll drag this black slider over until the front faces stop glowing. Something like that should be fine. Now you can use this facing option if you want, but that makes the dragon really shiny. If I pan around, you see how the light is interacting with it? So I used the Fresnel option because I didn't want so much of that shininess. You can still see it if I zoom in and pan around more to the side. You can see it start to change. So it's up to you. They both work. They just provide different results. So the next thing I wanted was a gradient where it's darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. So I need a few more nodes. So I'm going to add a mixed color node, a color ramp, gradient texture node, a mapping node, and a texture coordinate node. And I'll plug the generated output into the vector input on the mapping node. I tried some of these other options, but generated gave me the best result. Then I'll plug the mapping node into the gradient texture, and then plug the gradient color output into the color ramp. And I'll plug the color output from the color ramp into the top input on the mix color node. Then I'm going to take this layer weight color ramp and plug it into the bottom input on the mix color node. And then I'll plug the result into the factor input on the mix shader. And now we're back to this white color, but I can fix that by adjusting the color ramp sliders. So if I drag this black slider over, you should see the gradient start to show up, but it's not showing up for some reason. So let me see what's going on here. Okay, I didn't plug the color ramp into the factor input. I plugged it into the shader input. So now the gradient is showing up, but it's going in the wrong direction, side to side instead of bottom to top. So I'll change the rotation values here on X and Y to 90 degrees. And now you see the gradient is going in the right direction. And I'm also going to change this from linear to ease, which makes a little softer transition from dark to light. But I want a little more control over the gradient, so I'm going to click this plus button on the gradient color ramp, and that will add another slider here in the middle. So I'll click on it to select it, and then click on the color bar, and I want to drag this slider down towards the black, and as I do, you can see the color start to darken. So I'll set it right about there, and then I'll click on the white slider to select it, then click on the color bar, and I'll drag the slider down a little bit so it's a light gray. And then you can adjust these sliders to get the gradient that you want. So something like that is looking pretty good. Wait a minute, the principled BSDF got unplugged somehow. So let me plug that back into the shader input. But now the colors are looking really faded. So I'm going to add one more color ramp over here and plug it into the base color input on the principled BSDF. And now if I drag the black slider over, you can see the color starts to come back and get a lot more saturated. So there you go. That's the whole material setup. And here's a rendering of the two dragons side by side. So that's about it. I just thought that was kind of a cool thing that I stumbled onto by accident and figured I should make a video about it. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post them below. And if you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.